All right. Good evening. I've been given the cue that it's time to not only start the lecture tonight, but to start the entire lecture series, which sounds like a very heavy burden, but I'm going to do my best to bear it. For those of you who don't know, my name is Scott Schall. I'm the Associate Dean of the College of Architecture and Design here at Lawrence Technological University. And I know that if you're in the audience right now, you're saying, yes, we know that we're students or faculty here. Get on with it. But for those of you who don't know, we actually live stream and then mount to YouTube all of the lectures here so that anyone in the wider world can access them as a teaching tool or as a way to spend 2 hours, 3 hours? I don't know how, 4.5 hours of their weekend. I'm kidding. Their lecture's not. I saw some people's jaws drop. It's not 4 hours. You're okay. Yeah. And the people on YouTube can fast forward anyways, right? Once they skip the ad at the beginning, they go right in. Again, for those of you who don't know, we at the College of Architecture and Design, we have a accredited architecture program in interior architecture, graphic design, transportation design, industrial design, game art, as well as graduate programs in architecture, interior design, and urban design. Did I do that well enough, Carl? Fabulous, fabulous. So now I can get on the actual introduction now that I've taken care of all of that. So the actual introduction is introducing Austin Mergold, and specifically introducing Jason Alexander Mergold. Now it's my pleasure to work with Jason, actually a little bit ago when I was still a faculty member at Temple University. I don't know how many years ago, and that doesn't really matter, actually, for posterity. We'll say like 3. And we taught a studio together, and I enjoyed incredibly the conversations that we had, as well as those that we were able to elicit from our students. And then this summer, Jason and Alex thought it was a good idea to hang out with us in the summer studio called Critical Practice. And I think there are some of you from Critical Practice here. Others of you are still in therapy, and that's fine. We're rooting for you. But some of you are here, and that's great. And I don't know if you guys will be talking that or not. The firm itself is interesting, and it's actually relevant, the background, and I know they're going to go into it, but they both earned their Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University, and they actually were students, so they might have one day been sitting in an auditorium waiting for their associate dean to shut up so someone more interesting could talk, right? And then they decided to form a firm sometime after that. That's part of the origin story. They nailed it, yeah? They then went on. Jason decided to earn an MLA from Penn, and Alexander decided to continue a long tradition in his family and earn a graduate degree in architecture from Princeton. Yes? And then they decided to hook up, start this whole firm thing, and then they said, you know what we should do? We should also be educators. So Jason is with the Art Academy of University, or the Academy of Art University. See, I got that right? The second time through. And then you went back to your alma mater. He's at Cornell right now. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way and let them talk about the work of Austin Mergold, but I do want to say it's a great pleasure to welcome you to LTU, and thank you for kicking off our lecture series, and we're excited to see what you have to say for us. So welcome.
Thank you, Scott. It's weird to have this thing. But yeah, well, so thanks everybody, and I think Jason will kick this thing off.
Thanks for coming. All right, thanks. First, I guess the first part of this lecture is going to be a little bit slow, and then we'll speed it up really quickly.
The first 3 hours will be slow, yeah. And then it's going to go really fast after that.
No, in all honesty, there's going to be a little bit of background information on us that we'll be introducing, and then we're going to kind of talk about through a couple of the projects we're working with, and then we're also going to kind of reflect a little bit of our summer critical practice studio and charrettes that we were part of. I want to thank Scott for the kind words and also all of you for showing up tonight and allowing us to kind of have this platform to talk a little bit and spend 3.5 hours with you. So, without further ado.
Yeah, it's sticking really.
So, Act 1, the meeting. So while our design partnership officially and legally started in 2007, just over a decade ago, it unofficially began during our undergraduate architecture studies at Cornell, when we sat next to each other in a second-year design studio. Our visiting critic, who remains nameless at this point, was fresh out of graduate school, teaching his first design studio, and assigned our studio to reconstruct the Leaning Tower of Pisa at quarter-inch scale within 1 week. It had to be finely crafted in basswood. No fenestration detail could be spared. Column capitals had to be molded and cast with Corinthian capitals. But most importantly, no glue was allowed for connecting the architectural elements. All columns, arches, floor plates, walls had to be constructed using pinned connections. Our design critic further explained to us that our studio site would be constructed from the fallen, no longer leaning Tower of Pisa. The fallen debris, a confettied landscape of fresh, what we'd like to call spolia, would inform and create a set of site conditions and define the limits of our studio site. When the model was finally completed and we projected a new history, dropping it not just once, but twice, thanks to those lovely pin connections. At this moment, our conventional understanding of site was officially null and void.
Yeah.
Act 2, travels abroad. While at Cornell, we shared similar study abroad experiences, participating on 2 intensive study tours. The first tour was a summer semester to Scandinavia to witness firsthand the works of Aalto, Leverance, Studio Grande, Asplund, and Sverre Finn, as well as kind of experience the heroic Viking landscapes. Through sketching, photography, writing, collage, we observed and documented the integration of natural, local materials, the importance of site conditions as a generator of architectural experience, the celebration of native weathering and processes and found artifacts, and introduced to the ever-present horizon, a datum-wet structured architectural experience within while making larger connections to the landscape beyond. As students and visitors of a foreign landscape, we were first asked to look, then see, then tasked with how to read the landscape within the building and vice versa. With this new way of seeing and reading architecture, it was ingrained within our impressionable minds that buildings were to be genuinely understood in constant dialogue with its context. In the end, they were collage representations of the physical and the phenomenal attributes of their surrounding landscape. Structures were not objects in space, but culminated at the intersection of ground and sky and allowed space for the identity of the place, the culture, the myth to be equally considered within the reading of form, material, and the tectonic.
That's fish on the left, by the way,
Right.
in case you're wondering.
Yeah. Herring, I believe.
Herring.
Yeah. The primitive vernacular traditions of making and construction were not to be forgotten and erased, but instead reinterpreted, reconsidered, and further translated. Our second study abroad tour, a semester spent living in Rome and traveling the Italian countryside, reintroduced the use of horizon in the landscape as a serial composition of garden rooms, but more influential was our first formal introduction to spolia, a word and topic fondly and frequently discussed by our history professor when lecturing on the transformation of the ancient Roman landscape. Right. And this word we'll kind of come back to, but...
Oh, it's coming back now? No, not yet.
Not yet. Act 3, merging backgrounds and practicing how to practice. While we found some common grounding and points of reference within our college experiences, our childhoods couldn't be more different. Alex grew up in a dense urban fabric in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, which is the image on the right, and didn't arrive in the US until his high school years, where he attended LaGuardia Arts High School in New York City. Alex was raised within a family of architects. His father, his mother, his grandfather were all practicing architects and also were professors. So you could say that Alex got a bit of a jump start in architecture, attending studios and reviews at the mature age of, what, 5? 5. Okay. So while Alex was busy in studio reviews on the other side of the globe, I spent my childhood within the woods and the farmland valleys of central Pennsylvania, absent of urbanity but full of wildlife. Over time, I slowly watched the suburban development consume my personal rurality. I came from a lineage of makers. My grandfather was a high school shop teacher, my father a general contractor, and my mother was awarded Miss Crisco 1967. She's very proud of that. So it's interesting to note in these two images, it's almost they're almost reverse figure grounds in some degree, right? So the image on the left, just obviously a collage of farmland, agricultural kind of ecologies, and the image on the right, complete dense fabric.
But also a collage of the kind of west and east meeting in a really bizarre way. But that's kind of an aside.
We felt our differences in cultural backgrounds, our native environments, and even design interests were complementary. So in the heat of the 2007 recession, we officially started practicing architecture forming Austin. No collusion. No collusion. Forming Austin and Mergold LLC after each spending a number of years working in other design offices and completing graduate school. For several years now, we have been fueling our practice by taking on all types of projects with varying scale, scope, sites, environments, and client types. We even took on birds as our clients for one project. We have worked and continue to work in some not so glamorous, decidedly completely uncool design environments, such as the suburban landscape. We find ourselves working as cartographers on one day, master planners the next, and leading community engagement projects the following. Early on, we collectively insisted that turning down any potential project was not an option, not just for economic reasons, right? But maybe more importantly, it became an opportunity for us to expand our collective knowledge and expertise and provide additional insight into the underlying infrastructures that control placemaking and policymaking measures. For our early years of practice, the architecture competition served as a device for us to test new ideas and concepts, allowing us the freedom to recycle old ideas, revive distant memories from our travels and childhoods, or just simply revisit and reinterpret historic events. So, I mean, this is a little bit of a cut from how we understand our work and how we defined it back in 2007. We look at our work.
Which hasn't really changed, actually.
Yeah, it hasn't really changed that much at all, but our website needs to be a lot of updating in the process. So we see our work as work process as slow architecture, believing that it's preferable to rethink and repurpose existing resources than to tap new ones. We infiltrate existing systems that are responsible for built form rather than reinvent the wheel each time. So our first built project, right, a mini golf hole on Governor's Island. It was actually kind of a fun little competition that we entered in and decided we had to find something to construct this golf hole out of. So we found a bunch of debris from construction sites and actually found out that through looking at the research of mini golf in New York City, it was actually started on the rooftops of Wall Street buildings. So we kind of thought this idea of the putter on the roof would be an appropriate kind of way to title this project. And this has actually lived temporary on the Governor's Island, which we'll talk a little more.
3 years or so,
3 years,
yeah.
plus or minus.
The roof worked.
Yeah, never leaked.
The mice were happy.
Another project, Andy Sprout's, another kind of competition we entered last minute, but once again, kind of going back to this idea of change of seasonality and landscape horizon, understanding building or blurring the kind of sense of building and landscape. We also looked at objects. So this is a storefront display for Artimony lighting, which we worked with helium, lots of helium and balloons, and looked at kind of image on the right is where we kind of all started with the red line of balloons as a field. And then over time, if you look at the image on the left, the helium, as it would slowly seep, would kind of change the lighting environment within the storefront itself. Very, very minimal budgets, as you can see. Another competition was for the Engine 38 1% art project, which we looked at other sort of ways of kind of reincorporating traditional hose towers as monuments, and also looked at bigger scales. This is a competition for Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, New York, and looked at how do you kind of think about stitching urban fabric by very simple kind of community stakeholder means. Do you wanna?
Well, yeah, and this thing, this is a competition we actually won for once, which had to do with rethinking how infrastructure can enter the city. In this case, it's the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. And this one had to do with the idea that windmills are actually inherently present in New York City, like originally and still to this day in the very seal of the city. The kind of the official representation of it. So, you know, the idea was to kind of introduce a series of these things as infrastructure / public walkway / public art. And this one is, well, I mean, it's basically a backyard deck, but reinvented as a much more sort of glamorous garden for the garden competition in Canada. And I guess all this stuff culminated at some point in the Architecture League Prize, bless you, which, so here's a kind of a display for it. So this, so while all this was happening, we're also, like the competition stuff was happening while the kind of other projects were kind of slowly grinding through the office in various ways and also keep in mind 2008, when everything collapsed. So, but slowly we sort of figured out that there's a kind of, let's say, idiosyncrasies to practice. And this quote is probably at least my favorite, which has to do with kind of understanding how American architecture specifically works. It's kind of a relationship between, let's say, the blue collar and the white collar, except expressed in a kind of Jeffersonian way. So that seems to somehow permeate the architecture scene still to this day. So after all that stuff, after all kind of having done all these things, like any, let's say, architect of a certain age, like I think we're probably like in our 30s or something, we decided that we need to write a treatise. Sort of going back to the Palladian time. And actually it happened to be Palladio's birthday, 500th centennial, something, or 500th anniversary. So we called it 4 books, BKS, kind of taking into, like basically taking cues from Palladio himself. And the idea was we'll actually not only kind of take the cue so much, but take the method of representation, which had to be with a woodcut, and literally kind of essentially displayed our work based on the original Quattro Libri, with the idea in mind that it on the one hand, it's kind of was a nod to Palladio himself, but on the other hand, it's also basically a way of dealing or kind of framing what we've learned in our work and in practice in general. So these are the plates. There were 25 total. Actually, there were just literally took them down yesterday from the DT gallery. So this is what these things look like. And there were 2 exhibits, one at Cornell and then one at Temple, and they kind of represented differently in both cases. And so in this is where I would say the practice, I wouldn't say matured necessarily, because I'm not sure maturity is necessarily a good thing, but it somehow became, let's say, maybe slightly focused. We realized that certain things are important, certain things maybe not so much. And Horizon, as Jason described, was one of them. We realized that there's always something present. This is, I guess, the first kind of acute understanding of context. And that happened to be at the residency in Northern Ireland that we were 2011, I think it was. We kind of came to this place with some kind of a project proposal, and we realized it was totally ridiculous what we were proposing, because there's already kind of presence found on site, which is constantly changing, but at the same time sort of ever present as this kind of datum between sort of one state and another state. And as you can see, this is within, I think, 2 days. It was kind of ever changing and ever sort of fascinating. Well, so this is where I think we learned how to kind of appreciate context. In this case, like literally we had to actually kind of create maps of this place, because it like didn't even exist on Google. There was this kind of sort of yellow spot there. And that started to translate into things like this, and maybe this is where you...
Yeah, so it's interesting. So with a landscape background and kind of having the landscape experiences in Iceland, we came back after the residency and we started thinking about just land in general, and thinking about kind of the scale of land and understanding that all the kind of the metrics, whether they seemingly were there or not, there was a lot of things and processes happening ecologically, environmentally, culturally, on what it might seem as a kind of as a simple plot, right? A simple farmland. There's a history, there's a narrative that's sort of embedded in that. So we actually happened to be wine tasting one day in upstate New York, and
which we highly recommend, by the way.
Another office visit. No. So we were actually talking to the winemaker a little bit, and I had had done some classes in school in wines tasting, and we were kind of talking about the terroir and the land and how the land kind of contributed to the taste, the smells of the land, of the wine as well. And after talking to him, he was talking about how he never communicate what terroir meant, right? What terroir was, what it actually was, and how it actually could contribute to the wine, visually speaking. So we kind of, through a back and forth conversation many weeks later, we sort of went through, and actually he wanted a mapping of his entire kind of vineyard, which is located
actually several estates. So this one, by the way, it was kind of an interesting thing, because he wanted, on the one hand, a map that they can use, that the winters themselves can use to keep track of what they plant. And I don't know if you can quite zoom in there, but you can sort of see that there is every single row shown. And we've updated the thing since. But on the other hand, they also want wanted something to show to the tourists, like, oh, well, you know, here we are, this is what's happening, the people who kind of come and visit. So it ended up being this kind of multi-user thing, and I think this is version 38, if I remember correctly, so it took some doing. And I mean, I can actually even probably zoom in, you can kind of maybe closer appreciate this. Oop, maybe not. Never mind. Never mind. Anyway, but so mapping was kind of in a much more engaged, as it turned out, mapping is much more engaged exercise than just showing where, you know, point A and point B is, put it this way. And from then on, and this is, I think Scott sort of alluded to this thing, we also started looking into just kind of general land patterns in principle, and we realized that, and we're not going to sort of dwell too much into it because we can really, you know, go forever, that there's been a historical development, slow development that made, you know, for a difference between sort of rural and urban, which is obvious, and at some point suburban thing appeared, and now, as of let's say 20 years ago or so, that distinction actually quite started to sort of disappear and sort of became something else. And then we even kind of came up with a terminology for this thing. We called it rural and urban. So it's like a kind of the idea that it's a range rather than distinct condition. And we keep realizing that we're right, or at least would like to think so. Anyway, so like this is kind of an ongoing thing. It's backed up by various ways of representation, from drawing to data visualization, to even kind of understanding what density means. So this is like what 1,000 people per square mile looks like, for example. So, and before we knew it, the whole kind of teaching thing happened. So, and this is where, I guess this is where we are now to some degree. And teaching was, well, again, for me it was sort of, let's say, kind of it's a familiar setting to some degree, right? And in a way felt closer to home. Maybe for you it was sort of a little bit different, but the whole point is that teaching and practice became really actually kind of intertwined to the point where we actually kind of hard time sort of separating the difference between the two, which usually probably is a good thing. So as an example here, this is a studio to the Cornell last semester, which had to do with kind of idea of probing kind of architecture, not just as a kind of in the material sense, but also in time. And this is a kind of idea, this is where the idea of the core sample was developed, which some of you have fondly enjoyed this summer. And so this is Jason's.
Yeah, so this is actually developed
mapping.
in teaching at Drexel at this time. This work was produced, and the image on the left is a lot of Foundation Studio, kind of one particular student, but looking and seeing and how you see, understanding processes of the effects of the environment on built landscapes. So the image on the left, a lot of photo mapping. Image on the right was kind of retelling a story of history of the main line through time and how it's been kind of developed over time, and the factors and influences that have challenged its development as well. So that's sort of a little sampling on my, but you can kind of see the comparison in terms of the scales of investigations, the scales of interest of investigation, and maybe kind of the different modes of representation. Right. That's always been kind of one thing that we don't say kind of pride ourselves on one kind of representation type. It's really multiple and always a constant study of how do we kind of achieve other kinds of representation within the work.
Mm-hmm. So, and I guess we'd like to, we were happy to see that there is an exhibition of our stuff down there apparently. So we'd like you to, at some point, or would like to ask you at some point to take a look at it, but because we're not going to really talk about it right now. This is just a kind of public service announcement. So there are three types. There's an exhibition of three types of building that we, again, this has kind of been a little bit of a reflection sort of 10 years later. What's happening, and we realize we're essentially dealing more or less always with three types or some kind of hybrids of them. So it's like cans, A-frames, and barns. So they're not necessarily even building typologies. They're kind of structure, they are form, and then they're sort of program, right? So, but anyway, so you can go and kind of see that. But today we're going to talk specifically about three projects, which actually, well, like nominally we're talking about three projects. We're talking about probably a little bit more, but the idea, what we wanted to share today was more about how a project begins, how it ends, where it comes from. Because for us, it's always sort of different, and maybe that's, I don't know, good thing, bad thing. We're not necessarily going to assign value to this thing, but it's been working for us in the sense that I guess one can say we have, would like to think anyway, we have an open mind to things, right? That we don't necessarily bring some kind of preconceived idea. Some would probably argue, well, we can't tell what your work is because it's always different. Maybe it's not such a good thing. But again, we're not going to assign values. But all we're here to do right now is to kind of share how and when stuff begins. So the first project is Soil Arc, and it began with Hurricane Sandy and the big floods, like any arc. I suppose the flood is the first thing. And we won a competition for basically to design and to propose and design a folly, a kind of a pavilion, let's say, in Socrates Sculpture Park in Queens. So the question is like, well, where do you begin? And the beginning was, and actually I sort of distinctly remember this thing. I remember I was drawing something completely different, and then we somehow got on the phone with Jason, and we started talking about flood that recently happened, and like, wait a minute. This park was completely inundated, and then we started talking about arcs because that's what happens when flood happens. And then we remembered this crazy Viking ship that we saw in Oslo in 1997, something like that. So anyway, so before you knew it, there was this kind of conversation which came out both of some kind of shared baggage, let's say, from years ago, but also from this kind of current event situation. So, and then immediately following that, there was this kind of remembrance of this image, which is essentially, I think this is in England, what happens with overturned ships that are no longer in use. They become huts for storage of various materials because, let's face it, a boat is an upside-down house, an upside-down house is a boat, and actually there's even, I don't know how true it is, but one old professor of ours at Cornell kept saying that essentially the clapboard cladding of like a typical kind of framed house in the U.S. is more or less actually related to a whaling boat, because when they would spend the winter on the coast, the shipwright would actually build a cabin, and they would build it the same way they would build a ship, except upside down, because the water is up there and not down there. So, and that kind of became the generating idea for this thing, and we literally proposed this thing called the arc, and then the question was, well, what do you make it out of? And this is where, again, the kind of shared baggage came in. This is literally one of the first build projects we ever did. Actually, this is what I think we've informed the partnership for, to work on this affordable housing development in central PA, where we got to interact with a lot of vinyl siding. And this thing, obviously, let's say, is not particularly glamorous, to say the least, right? We're being generous here. Well, at least for me, it was kind of a fascinating discovery, because I've never really seen it before up close, and then I realized, well, first of all, it's easy to put up. It's actually a fairly ingenious system, and it turned out it can bend. So you don't have to side flat things with it. So we actually did some tests prior to that in Philly, so we kind of had this lingering idea about vinyl siding, what to do with it. So we've done some kind of full studies, installations.
And yeah, the image on the right is actually a gallery, a short little gallery at Temple University we installed and just sort of tested. And then we also popped a light in there just for kicks to see what happened. And actually realized
this happened.
And this happened, right? So it's like, oh, this is pretty interesting. Like, there's a little bit of a glowing effect that starts to happen. And then we had a kind of a curvature. We were looking at CNC cuts behind this to understand, what is the kind of maximum and minimum sort of constraints of this material. And then the image on the left, we thought, well, how much fun could it be if we could try to sell this thing in a gallery on the left and install an exhibit? So this is actually for sale in a gallery in the old town of Philadelphia. And
nobody bought it.
Nobody bought it, by the way. Good thing.
Still for sale.
Still for sale, if anyone. But it also kind of taught us what were the limits, right? What were these limits, and how do you kind of how can we learn from this in the future? Not necessarily knowing where this is going to go. Going back to the competition, when we won it, we said, okay, well, how are we going to construct this thing? How are we going to make this thing actually work? But also, kind of how can we maybe test some unexpected results from it? So the image on the left is, essentially going through the drawing process, as everyone would, for a project like this, to really see the idealized state, idealized form, right, to kind of get the precision, the measurements, but also knowing at the same time there's a limit to vinyl siding that is not quite going to kind of meet that capacity. So,
well, it also depends on the color, as it turned out,
right?
Because the elasticity of it is really impacted by the pigment.
Yeah, it's true. So you can make models as we did, test lighting conditions as we did. So, but also when you ultimately kind of build the thing,
As we did.
about 20 feet high in the air, and with not necessarily knowing how it was going to perform at all, you learn a lot along the way. So we actually, one thing that we had to do was flip the orientation of the siding. So we had to flip to make it kind of work and clasp accordingly. We had to kind of flip it and develop it that way and cloud it actually in reverse.
So it's actually, in that sense, it's actually kind of a ship. Right, because it's really upside down, and of course it leaked a little bit, but it made for really beautiful like sort of droplets coming through. But again, that's something that you can only figure out on site. Which was so, and here's the finished piece. So it's actually about the size of a kind of a brownstone building. So it's like 56 feet long, 20 feet tall, and they kind of sat there for a bit and. People were sort of like, I mean, I've seen a wedding in there at some point. So like there are all sorts of like kind of ambiguous uses to these things, which is actually quite fun. The back was particularly challenging in the sense that there's like no way you can really prefigure this thing out in any kind of simulation until you actually kind of go and do it. So we had to kind of figure out a different system how to make the back happen, for example, on site. But then again, on the inside, it turned out that the light works really in interesting ways. And again, depending on the pigment, it infiltrates the space very differently and produces kind of really sort of strange spatial effects. And at night, even more so. And I guess, well, here we are. So this thing, the reason why we kind of ended up, I think, where we ended up, again, in some reflection, had to do with, again, some kind of cultural baggage, and part of it was the Viking ship was in Norway, but part of it was also this kind of experiments with these kind of humble materials, let's say, or I don't know, nasty materials, however you want to call it. So one of them, the thing on the right, is what in Central PA is lovingly known as hog siding, which came from an earlier project. This is like even, I think, before the partnership was formed officially, right? So this is a kind of reconstitution of a barn into a clubhouse for a golf club, for a golf course on a disused farmland. And kind of the same idea there. This material turned out produces like really kind of amazing light effects, which was used to, I want to say, our advantage. So, and that's, again, kind of dwelling sort of deeper into these things, the idea of a kind of a structural system and framing typology also kind of came out from this fascination with the barn as both structure and as a program. And that sort of seeped into a project we're going to show you really briefly, which had to do with this kind of construction of a tennis court, which is a really kind of bizarre thing in the middle of Corning, New York, and a kind of quiet residential neighborhood. This couple wanted a tennis court. And we said, well, okay, we can do that, but let's maybe find something that's already kind of exists instead of inventing a bicycle here. And they somehow went along with that. So we basically bought a building, an agrarian building, off the shelf. So there it is on the construction on the left. And you can easily imagine cows in there until all the finishes went in on the right. And the idea was to kind of keep using this hot dip galvanized steel, which is, again, like sort of basically came out of that kind of upstate New York sort of cow language, let's say, right? Agrarian vernacular, as we would like to call it. So the whole thing kind of became sort of a strange reflection, perversion, if you want to say, on the typology of a local barn, to the point where at some moment in time we realized we actually some extra structural steel for various reasons. We're not going to dwell into it. And that structural steel ended up becoming kind of interior moments. So you can see, this little TV thing is sitting on these feet. This little screen was actually once a structural screen for something else. So anyway, so there's a kind of a series of global and local regurgitations that happened in this project, which we sort of fully embraced and the clients sort of sheepishly went along with, but I think in the end they're reasonably happy. And this is kind of, this picture particularly like, because here's the kind of little barn, and here's the big barn, and they, my dog and your dog are both dogs, but, that one is a poodle and that one is God knows what. So there is a kind of relationship, but at the same time, like a tension, let's say. And I guess we had to end up with a silo in there too. So this is a tower made again out of this excess structural steel that was never used. So, and I guess while on the barn subject, this is a house that's almost done in the on the Wasco Lake in New York, and there was sort of the same idea, except different programs. So same typology, different programs. This is literally a house for a couple who kind of want a big house, but at the same time they want a small house, which is sort of a really weird thing, because they have a big family that they show up to visit them a couple of times a year. So we ended up with this kind of a barn that sort of split open at 90 degrees that formed a courtyard and allowed for kind of a separation of the big house into two small houses, essentially. There it is, almost finished. You can see that there is also, even though it's 10 years later, there's some kind of echoes of the previous project of the golf course that was showed. Sort of the same idea that the materials are, not particularly not particularly kind of novel or different from what various cow barns around here are built out of. The color is even the same. And this is again the kind of a moment of, let's say, cultural background. This is where, so this is the image on the left is Iceland. There is, they have this kind of local fascination with this corrugated siding. And I mean, I'm not sure it's a fascination. I think it's just basically the only material available, it sounds like. So they made it kind of fascinating. And there's this, like what we refer to as a slanted corner. They don't, do what, like, for example, this building has this kind of really sort of interesting acrobatics as what happens when the metal siding has to turn the corner. In Iceland, they just kind of wrap it around. And it took me about, I think, 20 images like this on the left to convince the contractor to actually try to do it. And once they did it, they're like, oh, why don't we do that all the time? Well, so anyway, so that's the 20 years later, this thing kind of comes back to haunt you, what you saw in your 20s. So this thing, I mean, maybe I should talk about
this is actually a kind of a competition, public art competition as a permanent installation in the city of Lancaster in Pennsylvania. And it kind of came to us as it was stipulated in the scope of work with that the local brewery needed a water cistern to collect all the stormwater.
But not for beer.
But not for beer, right? So while there were hoppers on the site, there were other kinds of agricultural kind of artifacts located on the site for the use of the brewery. It was all about how do we kind of collect the water from the roof of the brewery and make it a public art performing piece, right? So the image on the right is actually an image that we kind of came across very early. It was a water stop. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with water stops or water stations along the way. In this part of the country, there's, with the railroad, Reading Railroad Company being playing a big role within the early transit development, they had these kind of water stops, they call them, to refuel the steam engines for the rail. So this image on the right was always kind of very captivating to us. It was a little bit, for us, it was a little bit like, how do you kind of take the grain silo and just obviously elevate it on stilts?
The image on the left is a musical instrument. It's a purely typological resemblance.
And that's not his dad.
No.
Okay. So, and then we also had started looking at going back to even like the Grand Concourse competition we showed you briefly, looking at kind of the city of CoAD or the city of arms for the coat of arms, one of these, for the city of Lancaster. And we started looking, and clearly it's an agricultural area. Clearly there's a history there. And we started looking, this came across these fascines, right? So this idea of bundles, right? Yeah. So the bundles, if you look kind of what's sort of circled there, and they're clearly represented and providing the identity for the city itself. So we kind of felt that was pretty fascinating, kept that in our back pocket as well. So the proposal, right? So these images and diagrams are not necessarily, we could say, not too fascinating, right? They're pretty straightforward, but we wanted to kind of get everything on paper for the town to understand where we were thinking about, where the questions were coming from, how do we kind of think about this thing beyond just the cistern itself? Yeah,
this is actually, I wouldn't even call it image, it's more like a list of questions and issues just in a kind of visual form.
So if you can see the community engagement piece right here, or the elevated cistern, that's actually the location that was stipulated for the competition. The hopper that's out front of the brewery, the large kind of barn object there is actually the brewery itself. looking at kind of like what could the cistern be? Is it a bundle? Is it a gateway? It's actually, it was on the, interesting enough, this brewery is located on the intersection between the farmland and actually the kind of development of the city itself. So it was almost on a growth boundary itself. So we knew it had to do something with the gateway, right? So we had to have some height, also going back to this notion of kind of the silo, the marker, the icon of the landscape. And then once again, this visibility, could it be something else? And what is it, how does it perform at nighttime? You know, and on top of that, we also added a component of thinking about how could it also be a community. There's a community art walk that's pretty successful there, and how could it be kind of another stop on the community, not necessarily a water stop, but an art stop per se. So
this is the summary of basically everything Jason just said visually, if you're taking notes. Yeah, go.
So the rendering, early rendering. Lots of drawings.
Crazy amount of construction drawing for a tiny little thing. Who would he? But actually, that's another thing we've learned. Having done our share of tiny little things, they actually take probably as much, if not more, work than the big things. Okay. Having done a couple of those. So models, and that's another thing. Like you know, you can kind of represent, like try different modes of representation for different means, and kind of come as close to an understanding of what is going on. And in this case, we sort of tend to build a lot of stuff ourselves. I mean, within reason, obviously. This one we didn't. So this is actually where we couldn't like say, oh, we'll figure it out in the field, you know, bolt here, bolt there. No, we actually had to kind of really get it as close as we can and work with the manufacturer to really get it right.
And so the arm itself, as you see the horizontal arm, that's the overflow valve for the cistern. So when it did kind of reach its capacity, it would kind of overflow into what you see a little bit on this articulated here is a little bit like this drip platform. So the idea that this thing actually made sound within the stormwater garden.
Which it kind of does. Dang.
So to close the street down, right, pre-assembled, prefabricated, it arrives. I think also this is kind of interesting kind of think about, you know, objects in the landscape, and we kind of learned a little bit through our own travels is really kind of walking around them from all angles, right? So the idea that this thing could actually be part of this gateway, part of an icon, part of a marker, right?
Or part of the infrastructure.
Or part of the infrastructure from the rooftop looking back to it.
Yeah.
Or even thinking about how is it kind of part of the landscape and connected back to the landscape itself. So you see right there, you see the curb where the little kind of sound drip platform.
The little ding, ding, ding thing is, yeah.
And
yeah, so there's the thing in the wintertime. I mean, sorry, at night.
Yeah.
And this actually, well, that image, again, like everything is somehow connected, it seems like, or at least, I remember an old sort of boss of mine I worked for before kind of starting this thing said, you know, there are only so many good ideas I have, so let's just kind of keep using them. So it turned out he was right. So we only have a couple. So this image actually sets up the next project fairly nicely because it has to do with a kind of the idea of a can and the idea of a strut system. And again, the word unistrut, I'm sure, should strike fear into people who went through the summer with us. But yeah, so this is essentially the next project, which has to do with these two systems, which are both local, American. Actually, Unistrut is very local. They still make them in Detroit. And this stuff was, I think, originally invented in the 20s, in 1926. The grain bin, the metal grain bin was patented. This one was it 1917, but sort of around 100 years ago, which, by the way, the title of this lecture, in case you guys missed it, had to do with this idea, right? So it's 10 years of the practice. It's the 100 years of stuff that we have, we meaning collectively as, well, as this country, but also as the world, but in particular, actually, this country, because it went through this kind of industrial boom in the early 1900s. So there's all this debris that we don't quite know what to do with. And the 10,000 years is kind of our small contribution to the idea that we want to keep as much stuff out of landfill as possible because it takes on average about 10,000 years for it to become like really inert on average. So anyway, so this is this next project, Oculi. And I mean, I know I had I can't say lifelong fascination with these things because I've only seen them for about 10 years. But Jason grew up in the middle of these things, right? So, but to me, what's great about the grain bin is that it's basically the only system that at least I can think of, architectural system, let's call it this, that is designed for disassembly and actually works as such. So you can take these things apart, you can take them back to, we just literally took the roof of this thing apart in like, what, an hour and a half?
If that.
If that, right. So, and we'll probably we're going to take it back to Ithaca and then make something with it. So you can kind of see this thing up close. It's a, basically pretty simple thing. It consists of these kind of panels that are bolted through, and then every now and again there's an opening in there. And we had an encounter. The photograph 2 slides ago was actually from a site in Central PA that we were working on. And this is when I for the first time saw those things. I'm like, oh, let's make something with that. So we're kind of toying around with this idea of a house in a can. And of course, Obama was president then, so can, yes, we can, seemed like a really good idea at the time. And still is actually. So, but anyway, so that we designed this house. We actually really spent quite a number of hours and sort of construction drawing.
And it's actually available for sale at hometa.com if you're interested.
Right, there you go.
Yeah.
Keep plugging it in. So on the one hand, it's kind of this agrarian thing, and on the one hand, on the other hand, it's also an homage to what Bucky Fuller did at some point, right? He designed one, the Amaxian house, or actually he designed kind of a series of these things. They didn't quite work for various reasons, and we, in our let's say humbleness, think that we figured it out. And we kind of designed with the idea in mind that you can actually have a single one, you can have what we call a 6-pack or a 12-pack, 24-pack, on it goes. And there's also kind of an aesthetic dimension. And again, those of you who kind of stuck around the summer have probably seen this image. And I kind of really like it, right? The idea is that the one on the right is the Pantheon, and the one on the left is, a grain silo somewhere in Central PA. But they both produce quite an amazing kind of phenomenological situation. Is quite sort of fascinating, right? So one is 2,000, give or take, years old. The other one is, 100 years, but they both sort of do the same thing to light. So when we had a chance to kind of get our hands on the grain bin finally, we kind of jumped to it, and the chance had to do with the return to Governors Island yet again. And there you see Governors Island on the left before all the subway fill was dumped on it, and the one on the right after. So you see it grew about 3 times as much, and the site was right in the middle, so which again seemed like a good idea. Basically, the site's on the dump. The site is on where kind of the stuff was reused, reconsidered, recycled, so whatever was once a hole became or whatever was once water became an island. So, and this was a proposal. The idea was actually fairly simple. Well, we thought at the time, to kind of create a series of these things, like kind of rings from the grain bin elevated up on the Unistrut columns, to kind of create this, like a series of these rooms that both track the sunlight through them, but also have a kind of a distinct dimension to them, artistic dimension. And this is where we realized that we need to collaborate both with structural engineers, because stuff really needs to stand up, but also with an artist. And that's exactly what we did. But it also went through a series of kind of tests and models, and I had a kind of an assistant eating soup for about a week to get the cans out of it. But it was good soup. So again, there was a kind of a study in drawing, study in model. We finally bought 2 grain bins from Delphos, Ohio, which is about halfway between here and Ithaca. They're 40-year-old grain bins. They've been there at the farm for a while, and they held corn in there, and now nobody needs them. And that's kind of another thing. They seem to be, as a kind of typology, this particular dimension, 18, 20 footers, are kind of a dying breed, because that small-scale farming is sort of disappearing, right? So now everybody wants 30, 40, 50, 100, massive things. And these guys, the kind of the humble versions of these things, are being scrapped. So we hopefully diverted one from wherever it was going. We brought one to Ithaca, we cleaned it up, we tried to kind of made a prototype out of this thing. Again, this is where we tested the colors, and this is where we worked with a colleague of mine in the art department to essentially create the situation where you have kind of 7 chances to match New York City sky. And actually kind of works. I had it once, it happened to me in construction. It was actually kind of a little bit weird. It was like totally transcendental. You look up and it's not there. It's like, whoa. So when it works, it works. So here it is up. It sort of almost works, right? Depending on the calibration. Look at that screen. Don't look at that screen. Right, so there it is. It's a sort of a strange thing. It was, like I said, two engineers had to kind of figure out how to do it without foundations, which is both kind of the idea that it's a temporary sort of thing, like it's on an island through the end of October, and then it's going somewhere else. We're kind of figuring out right now where it's going to go, and eventually, since the whole point was to build that house, right? So eventually it will become something else. So it has quite a kind of lifetime ahead of itself. And it's sort of situated in this kind of industrial waterfront of facing Brooklyn. You can see the sun tracking idea seems to actually work reasonably well. You can literally sit there all day and just kind of watch the ground and see the circles dance around. All the kind of detailing on the same, and they're sort of fairly simple, but still somebody had to work it out. And this is where, again, the kind of resource of the university was fairly interesting and helpful. So the Lab of Atomic and Nuclear Physics built those pieces on the right. And they were like, well, we can only do it to 1,000th of an inch tolerance. Is that okay? And I said, I think we can handle that. So yeah, these things are water jet out of like half-inch aluminum. So it turned out also, again, that's kind of an after-the-fact thing. The island wanted a do not climb sign, and they were proposing something really sort of hideous. And I said, okay, well, it's an industrial project. Let's just kind of do the industrial thing. That's the thing on the left. And then kind of a project signage had to go up, and then it turned out that the Unistrut can actually take a sign, like a blade sign. So, and here's the kind of the overall image of this thing. And basically, since we're talking about this kind of idea of kind of continuation and transformation, this quote is particularly dear to our heart, recently at least. The kind of idea of termination of use and termination of usefulness is not the same thing, right? So this particular project, the Oculi, definitely illustrates it. And actually, I'd like to think that, let's say, the majority of our work, one way or the other, at least tries to do it. So, and this kind of brings us back to the kind of summer situation again, this kind of idea of spolia, and specifically American spolia. So, for those of you who haven't heard the dreaded word yet, spolia is basically an ancient art of well, I wouldn't say art, an ancient concept of recycling, right? I mean, at the time, thousands of years ago, it was actually easier to reuse stuff rather than make it, just because they didn't have so much stuff. But at the same time, it was not entirely utilitarian. They had a kind of cultural dimension to it, so you can kind of take something, a previous civilization, and make a new one out of it instead of just destroying everything. And so the kind of proposal, or at least kind of the goal we're working towards here, is this idea that maybe the last 100 years of the kind of great American civilization, and we clearly, I think, entered a different mode at this point. So it seems sort of distant and also kind of strangely different now. It's time to reflect on it. And so perhaps maybe there's an idea of this American spolia. So this is kind of the examples of classic spolia, right? So on the one hand, you have Casa dei Crescenzi, so 11th century medieval building, which has like clearly been scavenged. But at the same time, again, there's kind of a beginning of aesthetic dimension to this thing. The thing on the left is basically what happened to just about any Colosseum that the Romans left behind. This one happened to be Arles. It became a city. So the form stayed, but the use changed. So spolia kind of has this interesting malleability that has to do with the kind of concept rather than, let's say, specifically material, specifically form, specifically use, or specifically, let's say, typology. So, and the question is how to even kind of begin to understand, how to begin to probe the past is a question here, right? Because like whenever you're dealing with kind of spolia, the past sort of floats to the top. So, and this is where we've been experimenting recently. And again, the dreaded word is about to come out, the core sample. Hello, summer people. So the core sample is kind of seemed like an interesting idea because it's used in various kind of fields that have to do with the past. right? So whether it's a study of glaciers, of study of old buildings, I mean, the idea of removing context and looking at what's left seems to be actually dramatically different from, let's say, an architectural section, which edits the context, edits the space, it edits what's there. This one, there's no editing, it sort of gives you exactly what's there. So this happens to be a sample from a foundation from an architecture building at Cornell, 1911. You can sort of see that, like, for the most part, it's concrete, but there's also some other kind of crap trapped in there. Like, I mean, one of them had even a cigarette butt. So there's, like, clearly kind of a presence of another dimension which is not material, but has to do with time and use and kind of occupation and just kind of lore, let's say. So this kind of idea of a core sample then all of a sudden became really particularly sort of fascinating. So this summer, we proposed this notion of trying to core sample the city as a kind of, as a site, right? So this is where what the kind of the crit prax started with. And we, you know, to not to drive everybody crazy, we decided to look at sort of building typologies, right? And that's how we kind of divided up the sections. And here are the three assignments, right? I mean, and one had to do with a kind of study of the building, another one had to do with the study of the site, and the third one was pretty open-ended. They had to basically figure out what they have, to summarize it briefly, right? And so we just kind of go quickly through one of them, and maybe you can kind of do a running comment on this one.
So this is the first one was like manufacturing. This manufacturing team looking at kind of once again the collection of the spolia, which happens to be the car industry parts. Looking at kind of light as a stream of light as a core itself, and understanding how those parts then kind of also relate to not just the building of it, but the building of a car, but also kind of the impacts of pollution, contamination, you know, other kind of airborne particles and so forth that actually do have impact on the neighboring communities. Then kind of looking closely.
Translation to the site.
Translation to the site, going into looking at kind of the factories here, con factories, and then also looking into the kind of the impact of sprawl relative to the manufacturing. So there's a lot of research that was kind of tying back into how is urban form making kind of impacted by the actual kind of manufacturing industry here in Detroit, and the kind of the growth and the shrinking of the city. And so the outcomes were basically looking at how do you look at a new vision for Detroit, or a vision that might kind of remediate some of these conditions that were once previously kind of here or are currently here. So the image on the left there, series of kind of the cores themselves for this one team, and then kind of then the reciting of these cores within a new situation, right? That kind of gives it a different kind of breath of air, different kind of life, different kind of situation to experience within the courtyard here at LTU.
Right. Well, so, and, you know, it was sort of, obviously an experiment, but I guess, I don't know, I'm pretty happy with the result. I guess, I don't know what Scott has to say. Philip's not here, right? So we can say what we want. We liked it. But the point was not so much to sort of design stuff, but to kind of pre-design things, to set up a situation from when things can start to happen, right? And I think it was actually pretty right. There were definitely narratives that came out of this pretty bizarre debris that these guys were able to procure. And, well, here it is, right? And if it weren't for the kind of time constraint, I think we could have probably taken it somewhere else. But again, I guess the point was not so much to sort of design new stuff, but to kind of take stock of what's already there and position it in a way that it can become influential and maybe, I don't know, sort of helpful in making new things, or at least considering what's next. So it's, I guess in a way, to put it really plainly, is the idea was to look to the past to really see the future through it. Because oftentimes that's quite sort of forgotten. So somehow seeing future means ignoring what's kind of around us, and I don't think we can really afford it, specifically in this country, because we just have so much stuff that's already here. So in that, basically what, we just took this exhibit down, but we can kind of summarize it very briefly. So this was what this thing was about, this exhibition. Here is the silo from Oculi, that, the roof, rather, that we didn't use. So, I mean, it was some of our work from the last 10 years, but we also made 5 specific case studies that, well, you know, core samples, let's say, that try to explore the various kinds of processes of spolia. And the problem with spolia in principle, right, is that you can't really draw it so much, at least I couldn't. So we had to kind of work with some kind of material dimension to it. And, you know, we can't go and rob a museum and dig up some old stones. So we had to work with stuff that's already kind of there and readily available. So these are, like I said, 5 case studies that go back easily 1,000 years in terms of what they study, but they're all made with stuff that you can buy in Home Depot. So there's Casa di Crescenzi, there's Melnikov's house, there's Teatro del Mondo, and then there is Moonscape. It's actually our own project. So and the poster itself was also kind of a, let's say, take on Spolia, because it was silk screen onto USPS shipping tube for drawings. Of course, nobody ships drawings anymore, but they still make tubes. And I had to convince the post office to send these things because they're like, well, look, they're empty. Like, well, yes, that's kind of the point. So anyway, it caused some serious conundrum out there in the postal sort of corridors. So I guess to conclude, this is what we want to say, right? And I think we already said it, but I suppose we can read it, right? So we tend to treat the past as a footnote to the present. Yet more and more it's becoming clear that the past, both distant and recent, must be a resource for today. And I think we can't sort of underscore that enough. Not only as a reference, but as a quarry of parts, materials, technologies, ideas, and experiences, especially in the realm of constructed environment. As a consumer society, we pride ourselves on a recent invention of recycling, yet ancients too had practiced reuse. They called it spolia. It was a way simultaneously destructive, preserving, and literally productive to regurgitate existing infrastructures, landscapes, buildings, and create new environments, programs, culture opportunistically sampled from various materials and ephemeral parts of the past. So these are the questions we've been kind of asking ourselves lately, and maybe you can at least sort of ponder them as well. So is there a new spolia? Can it help us deal with the kind of preservation debate that seems to overtake us, according to Ram Koolhaas? Can the contemporary culture be made out of the past? And can the understanding of the future be shaped by the kind of presence or knowledge of what went down before us? So on that note, thank you. And we're on time.
If you guys are game, we'll have a couple questions. Is that all right?
Sure. Yeah.
We'll limit it to only very, very good questions. Solid, vexing questions of substance. Everyone flees. The people without
scared.
questions, and they're like, I gotta get out of here. You might make me ask a question.
Can we ask a question?
Yes. To each other?
No.
No.
Well,
Done.
I'm just curious, like the rest of you who didn't partake in the summer thing, what were you thinking, like when you saw all this debris everywhere? Were you like kind of going crazy, or were you thinking that there is a hope in there, or like what was the reaction? We haven't gotten any feedback yet. Oh. I guess there's management right there. We should ask those guys.
Well, we've seen critical practice before, so we were not worried at all.
Well, it's our first time, so we're curious.
You know, I think we were thrilled that there were no students who lost limbs in the process. And, no,
As were we. Yeah.
And it came out well adjusted, and actually, I think learned a great deal from the experience. As you said, it becomes difficult to capture a conversation at times for what was installed, but I think actually the publication which you shared with us does that pretty well. All right, where the students kind of edit out. I have a question for you. Is that?
Yeah.
Is that? I have to. That's my obligation.
Yeah, no
I'm going to
problem.
sit there and like get at least
your
one
quota. Yeah.
question. So, if you could go back and talk with your professors beforehand, based on what you know now and what you think about the utility of the past and how the past should be viewed as a kind of a generator of what might come. And you could talk to your professor person that made you do the PISA thing, or whoever you want to talk with. What would be some advice you might give them, or I guess advice you would give yourselves, like of how we should rethink architectural education based on that? And as you contemplate that, I will tell you the root of my question comes from the fact that if you believe Claude Lévi-Strauss, this kind of division between the mind of the engineer, which has an assumed set of parts from which to draw an optimal solution based on gravity and the fact that there's always a piece of steel of X, width, like to combat it, and you design optimally in that way, as opposed to designing through the lens of the bricoleur, which is just what's around us and how do we work with this and reconstruct in that way, which it occurs to me that you a little more of the latter than the former, but I know that my education delved into the former more than the latter. Right. And I think that that often happens in architecture where we adopt, and I think probably yours as well.
Well, education.
I'm giving this to you.
I'm going to say probably something I shouldn't say in architecture school, but basically, it sounds like innovators don't study in the kind of innovative environments by the very nature of it, right? That's just kind of how it works. So, I mean, let me kind of rephrase this thing. Like, so we both came out of the Cornell education, so there was still like vestiges of Colin Rowe in there. He actually showed up a couple of times and kind of yelled at Peter Eisenman every now and again. So there was this kind of thing going on. They had a very particular relationship with history, those guys. I can't say it was, I mean, so it's like the kind of the beginning of POMO, right? That was the thing. I can't say I sympathize with their relationship, but I appreciate it. Right, so because history was very much present in education, I think that's why we ended up the way we ended up. We didn't go necessarily into the kind of neo-POMO territory yet, and I think we won't necessarily, but who knows. But so, I mean, to us, the relationship is very different. It's not, and that's why actually I think I personally kind of like this idea of spolia, because it's not formal necessarily. It kind of opens up other possibilities, material, so whatever, sort of so on and so forth. So going back 20 years and talking to professors, are like, okay, don't change a thing, just keep doing your thing, and that's because as a counter reaction, the information is there, but the kind of misuse of it happens, right? But today I would say, because like today what I'm seeing, I think and again that's a function of kind of architecture education changing because there's a lot more technology we have to kind of imbibe and deal with. There's just no room for stuff in the curriculum, so history gets cut dramatically. And this is where I think it's kind of getting a little bit problematic because you end up in this kind of situation where the kind of the engineering mind takes over the kind of the bricoleur, I would say. I know what you're thinking.
I'd probably also say that add on to that a little bit would be, I think understanding history, as a time frame. We always think about history. How far back do you go, right? Or what's the preservationists would say? Well, they debate over what time period or what era, or what's the most appropriate sort of lens to be looking through history, right? So, I guess for us, or at least for me, I think the question of history, or question of time, and your history, not necessarily our history, but your history and the future history of what happened, only 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? The Home Depots, the big box, and other industries, like it seems to be grappled with, but also forgotten already. Yeah. And I think that we didn't talk too much about tonight about the Searle landscape, where we introduced a little bit, but I think this in between is really kind of where that's not discussed because it's just not cool to discuss. It's one thing that to talk about the everyday, the commonplace, kind of leaves the architect a little bit, he's not really in these areas. He's not really working with developers as much, within these areas of helping those communities, which are going to be seeing a lot of growth, a lot of change, a lot of transformation happen. So there's a kind of a disregard for that history, or this current history that we're going to have to be dealing with the next years to come. So that doesn't necessarily answer the question. But I think just thinking about going back to school again and talking about kind of the everyday, the commonplace, I think is where we have to kind of also be.
Actually, illustrated history of Home Depot sounds kind of cool. I'd take that class.
Microphone, I have a couple more questions. Hopefully you said something controversial. I'll take a couple people off. No?
Tried.
You did. I know you did, really.
Maybe not enough.
I don't. Thank you.
It's okay.
This is a friendly group. Very supportive.
So, I guess my understanding of your take on spolia is the complete evolution of what one object used to be into a completely new and reusable object, and I think that can be applicable to what is happening in architecture, where we have buildings that used to have a different function and then we completely flip them in some manner that gives them a completely different function. And I wanted to ask, what is your opinion on how much of that historical context we should take into completely like redesigning these spaces, and kind of how we should address them in a term of like spolia, and redesigning these now no longer used spaces into something that can be used.
Right. Well, I mean, you're talking about adaptive reuse, essentially, right? Which is not quite, again, it's a fairly limiting term, right? Adaptive reuse basically means you have a shell of a building, and once it was a hospital, now it's whatever, fancy condos, like to really, really dumb it down. Right, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, and that's like, we've come this far to this point, right? 20 years ago, we just knocked the thing down, because it's easier. But now there is a kind of a lore. But I mean, it's not, spolia kind of has a slightly different dimension to it, right? There's basically an alternative to historic preservation. So for example, I know you go to, and again, it could be kind of a range. On the one hand, you can say, well, let's take any kind of coliseum that was in its lifetime, an arena, a church, a city, or kind of a zoo, a botanical garden, all sorts of crazy things, right? But it's still within, so nothing really happened to the form, but the functions changed. Right. So that's kind of one example. Another example is that where the whole thing got knocked down and was used as a quarry to build a whole other stuff, but you can still see in, like, I don't know, a new condo building, like, oh, wait a minute, the stone came from somewhere else. Right, so there's kind of, purely architecture speaking, there's a range, but then it's not necessarily limited to materials either. There is also kind of technique of making, right? Because there's, like, a lot of people know how to make a lot of stuff, right? And they're sort of reluctant to maybe learn new things. So the question is, well, I mean, learning new things is not a bad thing, but like, how do you leverage technologies that seem obsolete? Like, what else can you do with them? And this is where, I guess, the closest to that is probably hacking. There's like the whole idea of life hacking, right? So that's actually kind of a version of spolia too, to some degree. So it's not, like, I wouldn't say it's limited to building per se. It has quite a range of sort of applications, from like kind of purely symbolic to purely functional, and sort of everything in between. So again, that's why it's such a sort of accommodating little thing, that it's sort of kind of liberating experience. Plus, it really separates, or at least, or I wouldn't say separates, liberates the whole kind of preservation situation. Because like, you end up in this situation where you just can't do anything anymore, right? It's like, here's a building, it's landmark, that's it. And actually, that's what happened to Rome, to some degree, right? I mean, this place used to be basically just kind of recycling itself, and this was this was that, and then at some point they stopped. And actually now the city is dead. Everybody moved to the periphery, and now it's a kind of a tourist land. So, I mean, that's let this be, let's say, kind of a warning. So, I mean, did we answer the question?
I think one of the things I'd add is probably, I think it's a lot easier to, as young designers and architects, I think it's a lot easier to respond or react to something that's existing, right. Whether it's an artifact, an idea, a shell of a building, whatever it may be, and react to that condition, and necessarily kind of take it out of the kind of context and really kind of do something else. So I think there's a different kind of dialogue that happens that couldn't be possible if you didn't kind of engage with it, right? So I mean, in a very simple terms, I think that it's really kind of how you value. It's in how you establish your own value and criteria for what spolia means within your work, within a landscape, depending on the scale of spolia, the scale of the culture, whatever it may be.
Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you. All right. We are on time.